It's 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, and Pastor Michael stands in his kitchen staring at a bottle of sleeping pills. The sermon notes for Sunday's message about joy and abundant life sit on the counter next to him. He's already written 3 different versions. None of them feel authentic anymore. His phone buzzes with another text from a church member, upset about the new worship song selection. He hasn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 6 months. His marriage is crumbling. His faith feels like a costume he puts on every Sunday morning. And absolutely no one in his congregation of 800 knows. This isn't a scene from a fictional drama. This is the reality playing out in thousands of parsonages, church offices, and pastors' homes across America and around the world right now, at this very moment. While congregations sing about grace and healing on Sunday mornings, their spiritual leaders are drowning in silence, suffocated by expectations they can never meet, crushed under a weight they were never meant to carry alone. The statistics are staggering, and they've been hidden in plain sight for decades. According to a comprehensive study by the Schaeffer Institute, 1,500 pastors leave their ministry positions every month in America alone. That's 50 pastors every single day walking away from their calling. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. For everyone who leaves, there are countless others who stay, suffering in silence, medicating their pain in ways their congregations would never suspect, living double lives of public composure and private desperation. The Barna Group, one of the most respected research organizations studying religion in America, conducted extensive interviews with over 1,000 Protestant pastors. What they found should shake every church pew in the country. 42% of pastors reported they were considering leaving pastoral ministry, not thinking about changing churches, not contemplating a different denomination, quitting ministry altogether. And this was before the pandemic, before the political divisions of recent years tore churches apart from the inside. Let me tell you about David. Not his real name, but his story is devastatingly real. David pastored a thriving church in the Midwest for 17 years. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The church was growing. Baptisms were happening. The budget was balanced. His sermons got uploaded to the church website and racked up thousands of views. His family looked picture perfect in the church directory. But David had a secret that was eating him alive. Every Sunday, he would lock himself in the church bathroom for 15 minutes before the service and have a panic attack. He would hyperventilate, cry, and sometimes vomit. Then he'd wash his face, fix his tie, practice his smile in the mirror, and walk out to preach about God's peace to 500 people who had no idea their pastor was having a complete mental breakdown 3 times every Sunday. He did this for 4 years before he finally broke down in a deacons meeting and confessed everything. The response? Half the deacons wanted him to take a sabbatical and get help. The other half wanted him fired immediately for lacking faith and setting a bad example. The church split. David ended up leaving ministry entirely. He now works at a hardware store and hasn't set foot in a church in 5 years. He told a reporter in a rare interview that he's never been happier, and that fact haunts him more than anything else. The Fuller Institute, a leading evangelical seminary, surveyed thousands of pastors and uncovered a crisis that should have made national headlines, but barely created a ripple. 70% of pastors constantly fight depression. Let that sink in. 7 out of every 10 spiritual leaders tasked with bringing hope and light to others are battling their own darkness. But it gets worse. 75% reported significant stress-related crises at least once in their ministry. These aren't minor setbacks. These are crisis-level events: mental breakdowns, marital affairs, addiction relapses, suicidal ideation. And speaking of marriage, the statistics reveal a bitter irony. Pastors spend their careers counseling couples on building strong marriages, while their own relationships crumble behind closed doors. 80% of pastors believe pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. 80%. The Schaeffer Institute found that 80% of pastors' spouses wish their spouse would choose a different profession. Think about that. The person who stood beside them at the altar, who believed in their calling, who sacrificed alongside them, now wishes they had chosen any other career path. But surely their churches support them, right? Surely congregations who preach about bearing one another's burdens and loving your neighbor extend that grace to their pastors? Here's where the story takes its darkest turn yet. According to pastoral care organizations, pastors work an average of 55 to 75 hours per week. Many work far more. They're expected to be available 24/7 for emergencies, to have profound wisdom for every situation, to be perfect examples of Christian living, to be engaging communicators, skilled administrators, wise counselors, inspiring leaders, and somehow maintain their own vibrant spiritual life while pouring themselves out for everyone else. Now let me tell you about Sarah. Again, not her real name. Sarah became a pastor at 26, one of the few women in leadership at her denomination. She was brilliant, compassionate, and deeply committed to her calling. By 32, she was hospitalized for suicidal ideation. What broke her wasn't the normal stress of ministry. It was the impossible expectations. One church member complained that her sermons were too intellectual. Another complained they were too simple. Someone criticized her for visiting the hospital too much and neglecting church administration. Someone else criticized her for not visiting enough. A family left the church because she baptized their daughter wearing pants instead of a skirt. Another family threatened to leave because she wore a skirt and they thought it was too traditional. She was too young to understand real problems. She was too distant and professional. She smiled too much during serious moments. She was too serious and needed to lighten up. Every criticism, every complaint, every sideways glance in the church lobby chipped away at her sense of calling until she didn't recognize herself anymore. The woman who had felt called by God to ministry became convinced she was a fraud, an imposter, a failure at the one thing she thought she was supposed to do with her life. The Frank Minirth and Paul Meyer Clinic, specialists in treating ministry burnout, report that they see approximately 1,000 pastors per year who are dealing with severe burnout, depression, or anxiety disorders. These aren't pastors experiencing normal job stress. These are spiritual leaders in full crisis mode, many contemplating suicide, many dealing with addiction, many having already crossed lines they never thought they would cross. And here's something almost no one talks about: the financial pressure. While megachurch pastors with book deals and conference circuits might live comfortably, the average American pastor makes between $40,000 and $50,000 per year. Many make far less. Bivocational pastors, those who work a secular job to support their ministry, are increasingly common. They're expected to shepherd a congregation with the same dedication as a full-time pastor, while also working 40 hours a week somewhere else. The Exponential Center found that 25% of pastors don't know where to turn when they have a family or personal conflict or issue. 1/4 of spiritual leaders, the people their congregations turn to with every problem, have no one to turn to themselves. They're isolated, lonely, and drowning in expectations they can never meet. Let me pause here for a moment. If you're watching this, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Are you a pastor yourself, maybe watching this in your office late at night, feeling seen for the first time in years? Are you a church member who had no idea what your pastor was going through? Drop a comment. I read them all, and if this content resonates with you, if Professor Archive is creating videos that matter to you, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue investigating these stories that need to be told. Because this story, this crisis, it gets even more complex. During the COVID-19 pandemic, everything that was already broken in pastoral ministry shattered completely. Churches closed. Congregations split over mask mandates and vaccines. Pastors were caught in impossible positions. Some churches demanded they keep services going no matter what. Others demanded they shut down completely. Pastors received death threats for closing churches. They received death threats for keeping them open. Those who went online were criticized for giving in to fear. Those who stayed in person were accused of not caring about people's health. The Barna Group surveyed pastors during and after the pandemic. What they found was chilling. 38% of pastors seriously considered quitting full-time ministry in 2021 alone. That's not over the course of a career, that's in a single year. 46% said they were experiencing burnout. 56% found themselves in the middle of a cultural or political conflict with their congregation. Let me introduce you to James, a pastor who agreed to share his story anonymously. James led a church in a politically divided community. He tried to stay neutral to preach the gospel without wading into partisan politics. It didn't matter. Half his congregation was convinced he was secretly liberal because he preached about caring for the poor and welcoming immigrants. The other half was convinced he was secretly conservative because he preached about biblical morality and traditional marriage. He lost 40% of his congregation in 18 months. The church budget collapsed. He had to lay off staff members who had become like family. His own salary was cut by 30%. His wife had to go back to work. Their teenage daughter started therapy because of the bullying she experienced at school from kids whose families had left the church and were spreading vicious rumors. James started drinking. Just a beer or two at night to help him sleep, he told himself. Then it was 3 or 4. Then it was bourbon. Then it was drinking alone in his car in the church parking lot before evening services. His wife found the empty bottles he'd hidden in the garage. The confrontation that followed nearly ended their marriage. He's sober now, 2 years clean, but he left ministry. He works as a teacher. He told me in a phone interview that the day he handed in his resignation was both the saddest and most relieved he'd ever felt. Like watching a terminal diagnosis and a prison release happen simultaneously. But here's what haunts me most about this crisis. The secrets that pastors carry, the confessions they never wanted recorded, often involve moral failures that stem directly from their burnout and isolation. Research by the Leadership Journal found that 23% of pastors admitted to having done something with someone other than their spouse that they considered sexually inappropriate. These aren't predatory abusers. Many are broken people who sought comfort in all the wrong places because they had nowhere else to turn. They're men and women who craved intimacy, affirmation, connection, and found it in devastating ways that destroyed their ministries, their families, their reputations. The same survey found that 30% of pastors have viewed internet pornography within the past year. Again, these aren't statistics meant to excuse or justify. They're statistics that reveal a deeper crisis. When spiritual leaders become so depleted, so isolated, so desperate for escape from their pain, they turn to whatever offers temporary relief. Let me tell you about Thomas. Thomas pastored a church for 22 years. Faithful, dedicated, beloved by his congregation. His marriage had become distant over the years. His wife was involved in church activities, but they rarely connected emotionally anymore. A woman in the church going through a divorce started staying after services to talk. She needed counseling, she said. She needed spiritual guidance. Thomas knew he should refer her to a professional counselor. He knew he should have someone else present during their conversations. He knew all the boundaries he was supposed to maintain. But she made him feel needed in a way he hadn't felt in years. She listened to him. She saw him as a person, not just a spiritual vending machine. It started with longer conversations, then coffee meetings, then emotional confession that crossed lines, then a kiss, then an affair that lasted 3 months before his wife discovered text messages. The betrayal destroyed his family. His wife filed for divorce. His adult children stopped speaking to him. The church fired him. His name became synonymous with hypocrisy in his community. But here's what no one in that community knew. What Thomas confessed later in therapy, he had been planning his suicide for weeks before the affair started. The affair, as destructive as it was, actually delayed his suicide attempt. He was that desperate for human connection, for someone to see him to remind him he was more than the role he played every Sunday. I'm not excusing his choices, but I am asking us to look at the system that creates this level of desperation in the first place. The Pastoral Caring Course organization has identified several key factors that contribute to this crisis. First, the myth of the superhuman pastor. Churches expect their pastors to be simultaneously available and boundaried, vulnerable and strong, prophetic and comforting, traditional and innovative. They're supposed to work ceaselessly but model work-life balance. They're supposed to be authentic but never burden their congregation with their real struggles. Second, the isolation of the position. Many pastors feel they can't be honest with their congregations about their struggles for fear of being seen as weak or unspiritual. They can't be fully honest with other pastors in their area because there's often competition or judgment. They can't afford professional counseling on their salaries, so they suffer alone, behind a mask that gets heavier every single day. Third, the theological pressure. Many denominations and traditions teach that if you're struggling, you must have unconfessed sin or lack faith. So pastors internalize their pain as spiritual failure. They believe their depression is evidence that they're bad Christians. Their anxiety proves they don't really trust God. Their doubts mean they're frauds. This theological framework turns normal human experiences into evidence of spiritual bankruptcy. Fourth, the financial trap. Many pastors can't leave even when they're destroying themselves because they have no other marketable skills. They've spent their entire adult lives in ministry. Their resume says pastor and nothing else. They have families to support, mortgages to pay, children's college funds to consider. They're trapped in a profession that's killing them because they don't know how to do anything else. Let me share one more story with you. Pastor Rachel, 42 years old, mother of 3, leader of a growing suburban church. On the outside, she was thriving. Her church had just completed a building expansion. Attendance was up. Giving was strong. People regularly told her how much her sermons changed their lives. But Rachel had a secret. She'd stopped believing. Somewhere in the exhaustion of endlessly performing faith for others, her own faith had evaporated. She stood in the pulpit every Sunday preaching about a God she was no longer sure existed. She led people in prayer she didn't believe anyone was hearing. She performed baptisms, funerals, weddings like an actor playing a role. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. She felt like a fraud every moment of every day. But she had 3 kids in college. Her husband's business had failed, and her pastor's salary was all they had. She couldn't afford to walk away. She couldn't afford to be honest. She had a complete breakdown during a staff meeting. Just started sobbing uncontrollably and couldn't stop for 45 minutes. The truth came pouring out. Her doubts, her depression, her sense of being a fake, everything. The church response was mixed. Some showed incredible grace. Others were horrified. The denominational leaders suggested she take medical leave. She did. 6 months away from the church. Therapy. Rest. Distance from the performance. And something miraculous happened. Away from the pressure to perform faith, she slowly rediscovered actual faith. Not the polished, perfect Sunday morning version, but something raw and real and honest. She returned to ministry different, more vulnerable, more human. Her sermons changed. She started talking about doubt as a normal part of faith, about struggle as part of the journey, about mental health as important as spiritual health. Half the congregation loved it, half hated it. She eventually left that church and now leads a much smaller congregation of mostly people who've been wounded by church. She makes half the salary. Their family had to downsize. But she tells anyone who asks that she's finally free. These stories, these statistics, they point to a crisis that's been building for decades. The church growth movement of the 1980s and 90s taught that bigger is always better. Pastors became CEOs, churches became corporations, success became measured in numbers and budgets, rather than spiritual formation and genuine community. This created a generation of pastors trained to be excellent public speakers and organizational leaders, but given no training in how to care for their own souls, how to maintain healthy boundaries, how to sustain themselves for a lifetime of ministry without burning out. The Assemblies of God USA reported that between 2010 and 2020, they ordained approximately 22,000 new ministers. During that same decade, roughly 20,000 formerly ordained ministers were removed from their credentials. The revolving door is stunning. For every new pastor entering ministry, nearly 1 is leaving. Duke Divinity School conducted a comprehensive study on pastoral stress and found that clergy showed elevated levels of chronic health conditions compared to other professions. Higher rates of obesity, hypertension, and depression. They attributed this partly to the sedentary nature of much pastoral work, but primarily to chronic stress, irregular schedules, emotional labor, and the inability to truly disconnect from work. Think about it. A doctor finishes their shift and goes home. A lawyer closes the office and leaves work behind. But a pastor is always on call. A church member having a crisis at 11 p.m., the pastor is expected to respond. A death in the congregation at 4 a.m., the pastor rushes to the hospital. A marriage falling apart, the pastor counsels them. A teenager in trouble, the pastor intervenes. And all of this emotional labor, all of this crisis management, all of this spiritual guidance flows in one direction, outward from the pastor. But who pastors the pastor? Who holds space for their pain, their doubts, their struggles? The National Learning Cohort on Clergy Health and Well-Being, a collaborative research project, found that social isolation among clergy is at crisis levels. Despite being surrounded by people constantly, despite having hundreds or thousands of relationships within their congregations, most pastors report having no close friends they can be completely honest with. This isolation creates a dangerous echo chamber where pastors' worst fears about themselves go unchallenged. They become convinced they're failures, that everyone would be better off without them, that they're frauds just waiting to be exposed. And with no safe relationships to reality check these thoughts, they spiral into darker and darker places. Lifeway Research surveyed 2,500 pastors and found that only 54% said their church has done anything specific to help prevent them from experiencing burnout. Less than half, more than half of all churches do absolutely nothing intentional to protect their pastors' mental, emotional, and spiritual health. They demand unlimited availability and optimal performance, but provide no structural support for sustainability. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research tracked pastoral tenure and discovered that the average pastoral tenure in American churches is just 4 years. 4 years. By the time a pastor really knows their congregation, understands the culture, builds trust and relationships, it's almost time to leave. This constant turnover is devastating for both pastors and congregations, yet it's become normalized. Why do pastors leave so quickly? The reasons vary, but themes emerge across hundreds of interviews. Unrealistic expectations, constant criticism, financial stress, political division, loneliness, lack of support from denominational leadership, conflict with elders or deacons, family suffering, loss of calling, moral failure, mental health crisis, physical health breakdown. What's emerging now in 2024 is a new generation of pastors who are pushing back against the toxic systems that destroyed their predecessors. Young ministry leaders who are insisting on boundaries, who are being public about their therapy, who are working reasonable hours and turning off their phones at night, who are admitting they don't have all the answers. Some congregations are embracing this healthier approach to ministry. They're providing adequate salaries, mandatory sabbaticals, counseling coverage, realistic expectations, leadership teams that share the burden. These churches are finding that healthier pastors create healthier congregations. But many churches resist. They want the mythical Superman pastor who works 80 hours a week with a smile, who has instant wisdom for every situation, who makes them feel good every Sunday without challenging them too much, who's available at all hours but never seems tired or depleted. And so the crisis continues. Right now, as you watch this video, there are pastors sitting in dark offices, considering whether to end their lives. There are pastors day drinking to cope with anxiety. There are pastors in marriages so broken they barely speak to their spouses. There are pastors minutes away from crossing moral lines they never thought they'd cross. There are pastors who've already crossed those lines and are drowning in shame and secrecy. But there are also congregations who are waking up to this crisis. Church members who are starting to ask their pastors, "How are you really doing?" and creating space for honest answers. Denominations implementing mental health resources and removing the stigma around pastoral counseling. Seminary programs teaching future pastors about boundaries, self-care, and sustainable ministry practices. The confessions that pastors never wanted recorded are finally being heard, and slowly, painfully, the church is beginning to respond. Because here's the truth underneath all these statistics and stories: pastors are human beings, not spiritual superheroes, not professional Christians, not God's middlemen immune to the struggles that affect everyone else. They're people who heard a calling and responded, often at great personal cost. They're people who genuinely want to help others find meaning, hope, and connection. They're people who've given their lives to something they believe matters eternally. And they're people who are breaking under a weight they were never meant to carry alone. The crisis of pastoral burnout isn't ultimately about pastors. It's about what we expect from our spiritual leaders, what support we provide them, whether we allow them to be fully human or demand they perform superhuman feats of spiritual strength without limit or end. It's about whether churches will continue operating like corporations focused on metrics and growth, or whether they'll return to being communities of genuine care where everyone, including the leaders, can be honest about their struggles, their pain, their doubts, their need for grace. Because that's what grace is supposed to be about, isn't it? Not performance, not perfection, not hiding our brokenness behind polished presentations, but rather being honest about our struggles and finding acceptance, love, and support anyway. The pastors burning out in secret aren't anomalies. They're canaries in the coal mine, warning us that something is deeply wrong with how we're doing church, how we're treating people, how we're distributing the burdens of spiritual leadership. Their confessions, as painful as they are to hear, might be exactly what the church needs. Not more scandal to whisper about, but rather truth that forces us to change, to do better, to create systems of ministry that are sustainable, healthy, and truly reflective of the grace we claim to believe in. So next time you see your pastor, maybe ask them how they're really doing. And mean it. Create space for an honest answer. Let them know they don't have to be perfect, that you see them as a human being, not just a spiritual service provider, that their well-being matters, not just their performance. Because the alternative, what we're seeing right now across thousands of churches, is unsustainable. The most dedicated, called passionate spiritual leaders we have are being systematically destroyed by a system that chews them up and spits them out, all while singing about love on Sunday mornings. These are the confessions pastors never wanted recorded, but maybe, just maybe, they're exactly the confessions we all needed to hear. This has been Professor Archive, investigating the stories that shape our world, the secrets that hide in plain sight, the truths we need to confront even when they're uncomfortable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.